Chapter 5. Guiding the Policy Process. The groups and individuals who make up the lobby pursue two broad strategies to encourage steadfast U.S. support for Israel. First, they exert significant influence on the policy-making process in Washington. Second, these organizations go to considerable lengths to ensure that public discourse about Israel is favorable and that it echoes the strategic and moral rationales discussed in Chapters 2 and 3. We examine the first of these strategies in this chapter and explore the lobby's efforts to shape public discourse in Chapter 6. Because political power in the United States is divided between the legislative and executive branches, the lobby's tactics sometimes vary depending on which branch of government is involved. In addition to helping get sympathetic individuals elected or appointed to key positions, groups in the lobby strive to shape the political calculations of officials who might be tempted to chart a more independent course. Whatever a legislator's or policymaker's personal views might be, the lobby wants uncritical support for Israel to be the smart political choice. Like other powerful interest groups, in short, the Israel lobby achieves its aims by constraining the policies key officials are willing to consider, pressing them to take steps they would rather avoid but will pretend to favor, making it hard for U.S. leaders to sustain initiatives that groups in the lobby oppose, and shaping perceptions and framing options so that many key leaders willingly favor the policies that these groups endorse. Holding sway on Capitol Hill. A key pillar of the lobby's effectiveness is its influence in the U.S. Congress. Unlike virtually every other country, Israel is largely immune from criticism on Capitol Hill. This situation is remarkable by itself, because Congress frequently deals with contentious issues, and competing viewpoints are usually easy to find. Whether the issue is abortion, arms control, affirmative action, gay rights, the environment, trade policy, health care, immigration, or welfare, there is almost always a lively debate on Capitol Hill. But where Israel is concerned, potential critics fall silent, and there is hardly any debate at all. The absence of serious deliberation when Israel is involved was nicely revealed in a hearing on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process held on February 14, 2007, by the Subcommittee on the Middle East and South Asia in the House of Representatives. With Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice trying to restart the moribund peace process, the subcommittee sought testimony from 3 witnesses. Despite some differences on certain policy issues, all 3 are central players in the lobby. Martin Indyk, the former Aipac official and former U.S. ambassador to Israel, who now heads the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution, David Makovsky of the pro-Israel Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and neoconservative pundit Daniel Pipes, who directs the right-wing Middle East Forum. No critic of Israel, much less a Palestinian or Arab American, was brought in to offer alternative views or suggest the United States take a different approach. M.J. Rosenberg, who once worked for Aipac and is now a key figure with the Israel Policy Forum, a moderate pro-Israel group that actively supports a two-state solution, nicely summed up the situation. This was a hearing about 2 sides of a conflict where only one side was allowed to speak, adding that everyone who saw an official congressional hearing that banned the Arab point of view was either hurt by the spectacle or angered by it, and that damages the interests of America and of Israel. One reason for the lobby's success in Congress is that some key members have been Christian Zionists, like former House Speaker Richard Armey, who said in September 2002 that my number one priority in foreign policy is to protect Israel. One would think that the top priority for any U.S. representative would be to protect America, but that is not what Army said. Regarding Tom DeLay, Army's successor as Speaker, Morton Klein, the president of ZOA, said that he cared about Israel in every fiber of his being. DeLay himself said that he was an Israeli at heart. There are also Jewish senators and representatives who work to make U.S. foreign policy support Israel's interests. In 2006, in fact, a record number of Jewish Americans were elected to the House and Senate, a fact that underscores their impressive achievements in American society and their traditionally high level of civic engagement and political participation. Some of these legislators, such as Senators Joseph Lieberman, Democrat, Connecticut, and Charles Schumer, Democrat, New York, and Representatives Gerald Nadler, Democrat, New York, Henry Waxman, Democrat, California, and Robert Wexler, Democrat, Florida, are ardent defenders of Israel. Indeed, Waxman said in the wake of the 2006 election that there will be some Democratic chairmen who may not share all my views on Israel. He made it clear, however, that they will not be chairing committees dealing with Israel and the Middle East. He was right, of course. The chair of the House subcommittee that held the hearing described above was Gary Ackerman, Democrat, New York, another avid backer of Israel, while the chair of the larger Committee on Foreign Affairs is Tom Lantos, Democrat, California, who has no rival on Capitol Hill in his devotion to Israel. As one former Aipac leader put it, Lantos is true blue and white. But it isn't only the representatives themselves who can tilt legislation in a pro-Israel direction. Congressional staffers are at the center of the legislative process, registering the positions of outside interest groups and parsing different policy options for their bosses. As Morris Amate, a former head of Aipac, once noted, there are a lot of guys at the working level up here on Capitol Hill who happen to be Jewish, who are willing to look at certain issues in terms of their Jewishness. These are all guys who are in a position to make the decision in these areas for those senators. You can get an awful lot done just at the staff level. As discussed below, representatives from groups in the lobby sometimes participate directly in this process, helping Hill staffers draft legislation, providing them with talking points that legislators can use in public, helping write the Dear Colleague letters that legislators send one another to position themselves on key issues, and drafting and circulating open letters designed to put congressional pressure on the executive branch. Of all the groups that make up the lobby, it is Aipac that holds the key to influence in Congress, a fact that is widely acknowledged by politicians from both parties. Bill Clinton once described Aipac as stunningly effective and better than anyone else lobbying in this town, while former House Speaker Newt Gingrich called it the most effective general interest group across the entire planet. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, Democrat, Nevada, agrees, saying, "I can't think of a policy organization in the country as well organized and respected as Aipac." The New Yorker's Jeffrey Goldberg calls it a leviathan among lobbies, and Aipac's own website proudly quotes the New York Times assessment that it is the most important organization affecting America's relationship with Israel. Aipac's success is due in large part to its ability to reward legislators and congressional candidates who support its agenda, and to punish those who do not, based mainly on its capacity to influence campaign contributions. Money is critical to U.S. elections, which have become increasingly expensive to win, and Aipac makes sure that its friends get financial support so long as they do not stray from Aipac's line. This process works in several ways. To begin with, many of the same individuals who bankroll Aipac are often important political contributors in their own right. Using data from the Federal Election Commission, FEC, journalist Michael Massing found that between 1997 and 2001, the 46 members of Aipac's board of directors gave well in excess of $3 million in campaign contributions. And many of them remain generous donors to pro-Israel PACs and candidates today. Since 2000, The Washington Post reported in 2004, Aipac board members have contributed an average of $72,000 each to campaigns and political committees. Second, Aipac helps connect political candidates to other donors and sources of funds. Despite its name, Aipac is not a political action committee and does not officially endorse candidates or give money directly to their campaigns. Instead, Aipac screens potential candidates and arranges meetings with potential donors and fundraisers, and provides information to the growing number of pro-Israel PACs. According to historian David Bialy, the American Jewish Israel Lobby has developed since the Six-Day War into one of the most sophisticated and effective lobbying organizations in the United States Congress. It has done so in part by developing a national network of Jewish political action committees for contributing funds to congressional candidates, based on the criterion of support for Israel. As Aipac President Howard Friedman told the organization's members in August 2006, Aipac meets with every candidate running for Congress. These candidates receive in-depth briefings to help them completely understand the complexities of Israel's predicament and that of the Middle East as a whole. We even ask each candidate to author a position paper on their views of the U.S.-Israel relationship, so it's clear where they stand on the subject. Friedman's description of Aipac's modus operandi is consistent with testimony from other political figures. Tom Hayden, the anti-war figure who was running for a seat in the California Assembly in the early 1980s, explains how he won support from local power broker Michael Berman, brother of longtime California Congressman Howard Berman, on the condition that he would always be a good friend to Israel. Hayden, who won the election, notes that he had to be certified kosher not once but over and over again. The certifiers were the elites, beginning with rabbis and heads of the multiple mainstream Jewish organizations. An important vetting role was held as well by Aipac, a group closely associated with official parties in Israel. When necessary, Israeli ambassadors, consuls general, and other officials would intervene with statements declaring someone a friend of Israel. Hayden, one may note, merely held state-level offices in his political career, although he was unusually visible in that role. In the same vein, Harry Lonsdale, the Democratic candidate who ran unsuccessfully against Senator Mark Hatfield, Republican Oregon, in 1990, has described his own visit to Aipac headquarters during that campaign. The word that I was pro-Israel got around, he writes. I found myself invited to Aipac in Washington, D.C. fairly early in the campaign for discussions. It was an experience I will never forget. It wasn't enough that I was pro-Israel. I was given a list of vital topics and quizzed, read grilled, for my specific opinion on each. Actually, I was told what my opinion must be, and exactly what words I was to use to express those opinions in public. Shortly after that encounter at Aipac, I was sent a list of American supporters of Israel that I was free to call for campaign contributions. I called, they gave, from Florida to Alaska. Former Idaho Governor John V. Evans tells a similar story about his 1986 campaign against incumbent Idaho Senator Stephen Sims. He visited Aipac headquarters, where, according to Evans, they emphasized constantly that they were not a PAC, Political Action Committee. But they noted that there were Jewish organizations all over the country that had their own PACs, and that if we could contact them, they would be able to help us. According to the Wall Street Journal, Aipac steered Mr. Evans to a series of supposedly independent organizations, many of them run by people with ties to Aipac, that gave him $204,950 for his losing race against Republican Senator Steve Sims. Aipac also keeps track of congressional voting records and makes these records available to its members so that they can decide which candidates or PACs to support. Candidates or incumbents who are seen as hostile to Israel, on the other hand, can expect Aipac to guide campaign contributions toward their opponents. Internal Aipac documents acquired by the Washington Post in 1988 revealed that its deputy political director was actively trying to help raise money for several candidates in the 1986 Senate race. And the Wall Street Journal reported in 1987 that despite Aipac's claims of non-involvement in political spending, no fewer than 51 pro-Israel PACs, most of which draw money from Jewish donors and operate under obscure-sounding names, are operated by Aipac officials or people who hold seats on Aipac's two major policy-making bodies. Although the Federal Election Commission later ruled that there was insufficient evidence to conclude that Aipac controlled the network of pro-Israel PACs, the belief that Aipac helps guide contributions remains widespread. Veteran diplomat David Newsom, who served as Assistant Secretary of State in the Nixon administration and as Undersecretary of State under Jimmy Carter, reports that when a prominent member of Congress was once asked the reason for the power of Aipac in the legislature, he replied, "Money. It's as simple as that." The Center for Responsive Politics, CRP, a nonpartisan research group that tracks campaign contributions, has identified roughly 36 pro-Israel PACs active in recent elections. In the 2006 midterms, these groups gave over $3 million to candidates from both parties. Between 1990 and 2004, reports The Economist, pro-Israel groups contributed nearly $57 million to candidates and parties, while Arab American and Muslim PACs contributed slightly less than $800,000. When combined with individual contributions to particular candidates and donations given to the national party organizations themselves, pro-Israel forces wield considerable electoral clout. According to CRP's Stephen Weiss, if you are a candidate and you get the pro-Israel label from Aipac, the money will start coming in from contributors all over the country. There is little doubt about the potency of these tactics. In 2006, for example, money from pro-Israel groups and individuals helped Senator Joseph Lieberman retain his seat by running independently following his defeat by Ned Lamont in the Democratic primary. Lieberman received a total of over $145,000 from 24 different pro-Israel PACs, and none of these groups helped Lamont. In the same year, $76,000 worth of pro-Israel PAC contributions helped Sheldon Whitehouse defeat incumbent Senator Lincoln Chafee, Republican Rhode Island, who had long been regarded as lukewarm on Israel. Other beneficiaries of pro-Israel PAC support included successful candidates such as Robert Menendez, Democrat New Jersey, and Brad Ellsworth, Democrat Indiana. According to Ron Campius of the Jewish Telegraph Agency, The money for these and other candidates was raised by a loose network of donors, many of whom have strong ties to Aipac, the pro-Israel lobby. Aipac and its related network cannot influence every election, of course, and even large donations from pro-Israel groups could not get Lonsdale or Evans elected, or prevent former Senate Minority Leader Tom Daschle, Democrat South Dakota, or incumbent Senator Rick Santorum, Republican Pennsylvania, from being defeated in their respective bids for re-election in 2004 and 2006. But over the past 3 decades, it has helped many successful candidates win their races, while driving from office a number of individuals it considered unfriendly to Israel. In 2002, for example, it helped defeat Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney, Democrat Georgia, by funneling campaign money to her opponents. McKinney returned to office in 2004, but was again defeated for re-election in 2006. Hank Johnson, her victorious opponent in the 2006 Democratic primary, received at least $34,000 from 7 pro-Israel PACs. In another well-known case, wealthy Chicago businessman and former Aipac President Robert Asher helped recruit and vet an Illinois attorney, Richard Durbin, to run against incumbent Congressman Paul Findley, Republican Illinois, in 1982. Durbin had never held elected office, and as Asher later recalled, "I probed Durbin's views. I wanted to make sure we were supporting someone who was not only against Paul Findley, but also a friend of Israel. He beat Findley with a lot of help from Jews, in-state and out of state. Now, how did the Jewish money find him? I traveled around the country talking about how we had the opportunity to defeat someone unfriendly to Israel, and the gates opened." Asher solicited funds with a letter to potential donors declaring that the election was the best chance to remove a dangerous enemy of Israel from Congress, and Durbin eventually received a total of $104,325 in campaign funds from 31 different pro-Israel PACs. By way of comparison, in the 1982 election, other Illinois congressional candidates received an average of about $3,700 from the same groups. Durbin went on to narrowly beat Findley, who had served 11 previous terms, and he later won election to the Senate, where he currently serves as Majority Whip. In 2002, Meyer Bubba Mitchell, another member of the Gang of Four, the group of wealthy donors that guides Aipac's policymaking, used similar tactics to oust Congressman Earl Hilliard, Democrat Alabama. Like Durbin, Hilliard's opponent got financial help from Aipac supporters across the country. According to the New Yorker's Jeffrey Goldberg, Asher later said that he had asked Bubba how he felt after Hilliard's opponent won, and he said, "Just like you did when Durbin got elected." Aipac has also played an important role in defeating a number of other politicians who took positions it disagreed with, including Representative Pete McCloskey, Republican California, and Senators J. William Fulbright, Democrat Arizona, and Roger Jepsen, Republican Iowa, to name a few. Jepsen's fate is particularly revealing. He was targeted after he succumbed to a personal plea from President Ronald Reagan and agreed to support the 1981 sale of AWACS aircraft to Saudi Arabia. His opponent in the 1984 Senate race, Democrat Tom Harkin, received over $100,000 in pro-Israel PAC money, and Jepsen lost his seat. Senator Alan Cranston, Democrat California, later commented that Jepsen's fate has sort of struck terror into the hearts of senators about switching on Middle East votes. Another example of the lobby's ability to influence elections concerns former Senator Adlai Stevenson, Democrat Illinois, who ran for governor of Illinois in 1982. He first ran afoul of pro-Israel forces in 1980 when he introduced an amendment to a Senate bill that called for reducing foreign aid to Israel if it did not stop building settlements. Stevenson knew the amendment would never pass, but he wanted to show that his colleagues would support Israel even if it was acting in ways that were contrary to official U.S. policy. The measure was easily defeated, gaining only 7 votes. One reluctant opponent of the amendment, Senator Quentin Burdick, Democrat, North Dakota, told the Illinois senator, "Sorry, Adlai, but I am up for re-election." When Stevenson ran for governor 2 years later, he quickly discovered that campaign contributions began to dry up, and indeed went to his opponent. According to the former senator, he and his wife were reviled as anti-Semitic. Some in the press turned hostile. Jewish Democratic committeemen wilted under pressure. Jewish friends and supporters were also reviled. Stevenson was narrowly defeated, and as he later said, the lobby made the difference in that election many times over. Perhaps the most renowned example of the costs that can befall a politician who crosses Aipac is the defeat of Senator Charles Percy, Republican Illinois, in 1984. Despite a generally pro-Israel voting record, Percy incurred Aipac's wrath by declining to sign the Aipac-sponsored Letter of 76, protesting President Ford's threatened reassessment of U.S. Middle East policy in 1975. He also made the mistake of calling PLO leader Yasser Arafat more moderate than some other Palestinian terrorists. Percy's opponents in both the primary and general election in 1984 received large sums from pro-Israel PACs, and a businessman from another state, California, Michael Goland, who was also a major contributor to Aipac, spent $1.1 million on anti-Percy advertising in Illinois. Goland was later convicted of making illegal campaign contributions in the 1986 California Senate race. As Tom Dine boasted after Percy's narrow defeat, all the Jews in America from coast to coast gathered to oust Percy, and the American politicians, those who hold public positions now and those who aspire, got the message. Dine's hyperbole notwithstanding, the basic lesson of these cases is hard to miss. As J.J. Goldberg, the editor of The Forward, said in 2002, "There is this image in Congress that you don't cross these people or they take you down." Aipac and pro-Israel PACs focus on more than getting Israel-friendly candidates elected. They have also had notable success turning politicians who have been critical of Israel into steadfast supporters. Former Senator Jesse Helms, Republican North Carolina, was an outspoken critic of the U.S. foreign aid program for much of his career, which also meant that he opposed giving substantial aid to Israel. In 1984, however, Helms was in a hard-fought and expensive race for re-election against James Hunt, the popular governor of North Carolina. Sensing an opportunity to put a formidable enemy out of business, Aipac channeled large amounts of campaign money to Hunt, who came within a hair of winning. Helms got the message. He traveled to Israel the following year and had his picture taken with a yarmulke on his head, kissing the Western Wall. The same trip also produced a picture of the senator with Ariel Sharon for his office wall. More important, Helms became a vocal supporter of Israel and remained one until his retirement in 2002. One sees a similar evolution on the part of Senator Hillary Clinton, whose support for Palestinian statehood in 1998 and public embrace of Suha Arafat, wife of Yasser Arafat, in 1999 provoked strong criticism from groups in the lobby. Clinton became an ardent defender of Israel once she began running for office herself, and she now gets strong backing, including financial support, from pro-Israel organizations and individuals. After Clinton appeared at a pro-Israel rally in July 2006 and expressed strong support for Israel's highly destructive war against Lebanon, Helen Friedman, executive director of the hardline Americans for a Safe Israel, declared, "I thought her remarks were very good, especially in light of her history, and we can't forget her kiss to Suha." Pro-Israel PACs contributed more than $30,000 to Clinton's 2006 re-election campaign, and the Forward reported in January 2007 that Clinton was expected to snare the lion's share of the Jewish community's substantial political donations in the race for the 2008 Democratic presidential nomination. If electoral pressure and persuasion don't work, Aipac has been known to threaten politicians who appear reluctant to follow its lead. In 2006, for example, Congresswoman Betty McCollum, Democrat Minnesota, a liberal with a solid pro-Israel voting record, nonetheless opposed the Aipac-backed Palestinian Anti-Terrorism Act. The measure, which sought to impose draconian measures on the Palestinian Authority in the aftermath of the election of Hamas, was also opposed by the State Department, the Catholic bishops, and other pro-Israel groups like Americans for Peace Now and the Israel-Policy Forum. Nonetheless, an Aipac lobbyist told McCollum's chief of staff that the representative's support for terrorists will not be tolerated, a threat that led McCollum to demand an apology from Aipac chief Howard Corr and to bar Aipac representatives from her offices. The basic message is clear. Any senator or representative who crosses Aipac is playing with fire. Although the lobby's efforts are hardly the only reason that these defeated candidates faced electoral challenges and eventually lost, for example, Cynthia McKinney's prospects were also damaged by a much-publicized confrontation with a Capitol Hill security guard, and Lincoln Chafee faced an uphill battle given anti-Republican sentiment in 2006. Its ability to affect a politician's electoral prospects is well known. As one congressional source put it in 1991, voting against Israel has become like voting against lumber in Washington state, except Aipac does it all over the country. And that is why Morris Amate, the former Aipac director who later served as the organization's treasurer, could say in 2002 that everyone seems to be very good nowadays, and why Jimmy Carter said in February 2007 that "I don't see any present prospect that any member of the U.S. Congress, the House, or Senate would say, 'Let's take a balanced position between Israel and the Palestinians and negotiate a peace agreement.'" He added, "It's almost politically suicidal for a member of the Congress who wants to seek re-election to take any stand that might be interpreted as anti-policy of the conservative Israeli government." Aipac's clout also explains why attendance at its annual policy conference has become a command performance for prominent members of both parties, as well as leading officials from the executive branch. Speakers at the 2007 policy conference included Vice President Dick Cheney, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, Democrat California, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid and Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican Kentucky, and House Minority Leader John Boehner, Republican Ohio. The previous year's speakers included Cheney, Boehner, UN Ambassador John Bolton, Senators Susan Collins, Republican Maine, and Evan Bayh, Democrat Indiana, and Representatives Roy Blunt, Republican Missouri, Shelley Berkeley, Democrat Nevada, Arthur Davis, Democrat Alabama, Bill Pascrell, Democrat New Jersey, and Robert Wexler, as well as former Senator and presidential hopeful John Edwards. Speakers in other years have included President George W. Bush, Secretaries of State Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, former House Speakers Dennis Hastert, Republican Illinois, Richard Armey, and Newt Gingrich, and a bevy of prominent pro-Israel pundits. It is hard to think of any other lobbying organization that is wooed as strenuously by politicians in both parties. AIPAC's ability to influence elections helps ensure that Israel gets generous aid each year and makes it dangerous for senators or representatives to utter even mild criticisms of Israel's conduct. But its influence on Capitol Hill goes even farther. Lobbying groups of all types exercise influence not merely by direct persuasion and by using campaign contributions to gain access, but also by providing a legislative subsidy to sympathetic lawmakers and supplying overworked staffs with direct assistance in analyzing issues, framing legislation, and offering talking points and speeches to give to constituents. Not only does every member of Congress receive AIPAC's biweekly newsletter Near East Report, its personnel are also available to help staffers when issues affecting Israel arise. According to Douglas Bloomfield, a former AIPAC staff member, it is common for members of Congress and their staffs to turn to AIPAC first when they need information, before calling the Library of Congress, the Congressional Research Service, committee staff, or administration experts. More important, he notes that AIPAC is often called upon to draft speeches, work on legislation, advise on tactics, perform research, collect co-sponsors, and marshal votes. In other words, AIPAC inserts itself directly into the legislative and policy-making process with considerable frequency, as we explore in more detail in Part 2. To seal the deal, an AIPAC sister organization, the American Israel Education Foundation, AIEF, funds free congressional trips to Israel itself. These junkets burnish a legislator's pro-Israel credentials and facilitate fundraising, and also expose them to the policy preferences and basic worldview of Israel's leaders. This situation helps explain why about 10% of all congressional trips overseas are to Israel, even though it is but one of the nearly 200 countries in the world. The Center for Public Integrity reports that AIEF spent nearly $1 million on these visits from January 2000 to mid-2005. Not surprisingly, AIPAC and other Jewish groups lobbied hard and successfully to make sure that the new ethics rules enacted following the Jack Abramoff and Tom DeLay scandals did not interfere with these visits. It is important to emphasize again that AIPAC's activities are similar to the behavior of other influential lobbies and consistent with the interest group tradition of the U.S. political system. In his study, Jews and American Politics, Stephen Isaacs described AIPAC's Morris Amite, saying, "What is important is that none of this is untoward. You use the traditional tactics of the democracy, letters, calls." These traditional tactics to influence Congress also enable the lobby to put pressure on the executive branch when it takes actions that are considered to be not in Israel's interest. When that happens, the president or cabinet official is likely to get a hard-hitting letter from one or both houses of Congress, signed by most of its members, as President Gerald Ford did when he threatened a reassessment of U.S.-Israeli relations in 1975. President Bush got a similar letter in April 2002, when he briefly sought to pressure Israel to end a large-scale military incursion in the occupied territories. The lopsided percentage of signatories for each of these letters is eloquent testimony to Aipac's ability to twist arms. As Senator Daniel Inouye, Democrat Hawaii, commented after signing the letter to Ford in 1975, "It's easier to sign one letter than to answer 5,000. Or, as Senator John Culver, Democrat Iowa, later admitted, "The pressure was just too great. I caved." Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice felt the same pressure as she sought to restart the peace process by visiting the Middle East in March 2007. Just before her departure, Rice received an Aipac-sponsored letter signed by 79 senators, urging her to avoid contact with the new Palestinian unity government until it recognized Israel, renounced terror, and agreed to abide by Israeli-Palestinian agreements. No wonder former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger once told Aipac's Tom Dine, "Dine, I deal with you because you could hurt me." The bottom line is that Aipac, which bills itself as America's pro-Israel lobby, has an almost unchallenged hold on Congress. One of the three main branches of the American government is firmly committed to supporting Israel. Open debate about U.S. policy toward Israel does not occur there, even though that policy has important consequences for the entire world. As Senator Ernest Hollings, Democrat South Carolina, noted as he was leaving office in 2004, "You can't have an Israeli policy other than what Aipac gives you around here." Another senator, speaking on condition of anonymity, told a Washington Post reporter in 1991, "My colleagues think Aipac is a very, very powerful organization that is ruthless and very, very alert. 80% of the senators here roll their eyes on some of the votes. They know that what they're doing isn't what they really believe is right, but why fight on a situation where they're liable to get beat up on?" Small wonder, then, that former Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon once told an American audience, "When people ask me how they can help Israel, I tell them, help Aipac." His successor, Ehud Olmert, agrees, remarking, "Thank God we have Aipac, the greatest supporter and friend we have in the whole world." The making of pro-Israel presidents. Whether through influence on Congress or in more direct ways, groups in the lobby also exert significant leverage over the executive branch. American presidents are not as sensitive to pressure as Congress is, and most of them have taken positions that Israel or the lobby opposed at one time or another. But such instances are becoming increasingly rare, even though Israel's strategic value has declined, and some of its actions, such as the continued effort to colonize the occupied territories, are at odds with stated U.S. policy. Influence over the executive branch derives in part from the impact Jewish voters have on presidential elections. Despite their small numbers in the population, less than 3%, American Jews make large campaign donations to candidates from both parties. As presidential advisor and former White House Chief of Staff Hamilton Jordan wrote in a confidential memorandum to President Jimmy Carter, "Wherever there is major political fundraising in this country, you will find American Jews playing a significant role." Indeed, the Washington Post once estimated that Democratic presidential candidates depend on Jewish supporters to supply as much as 60% of the money raised from private sources. Other estimates are lower, but contributions from Jewish Americans form a substantial share, between 20 and 50%, of the contributions made to the Democratic Party and its presidential candidates. Israel is not the only issue that inspires these contributions, of course, but candidates who are perceived as hostile or even indifferent to Israel, run the risk of seeing some of these funds go to their opponents. Furthermore, Jewish voters have high turnout rates and are concentrated in key states like California, Florida, Illinois, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania, which increases their weight in determining who becomes president. Although they still favor the Democratic Party, their support for Democratic candidates can no longer be taken for granted. John F. Kennedy received 82% of the Jewish vote in 1960, for example, but George McGovern received only 64% in 1972, and Jimmy Carter got a mere 45% in 1980. In close races, therefore, the so-called Jewish vote can tip the balance in key states. Jeffrey Helmreich of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs exaggerates only slightly when he writes that American Jewish voters maintain the potential to be the decisive factor in national election results. American Jews wield power through their high concentration in key states and their tendency to behave as a swing vote in ways that set them apart from virtually all other groups in American politics. Because Jewish voters matter in close elections, presidential candidates go to considerable lengths to cultivate their support. Indeed, a 2007 story in the Jerusalem Post referred to this effort to court Jewish support as a Washington ritual as reliable as the cherry blossoms. Candidates are especially eager to appeal to Aipac and other organizations in the lobby, and not just to Jewish voters as a bloc, because they know that the seal of approval from these prominent organizations will facilitate fundraising and encourage higher turnout on their behalf. Gaining and retaining that support means backing Israel down the line, which is why presidential candidates John Edwards, Mitt Romney, and John McCain all made emphatic pro-Israel speeches to the 2007 Herzliya Conference, an annual meeting on Israeli national security, organized by the hawkish Institute for Policy and Strategy. They wanted to avoid the fate that befell Howard Dean in the 2004 presidential campaign when he made the mistake of recommending that the United States take a more even-handed role in the Arab-Israeli conflict. In response, one of Dean's rivals for the nomination, Joseph Lieberman, accused him of selling Israel down the river and labeled his statement irresponsible. Even more remarkably, virtually all of the top Democrats in the House of Representatives signed a hard-hitting letter to Dean criticizing his comments, and the Chicago Jewish Star reported that anonymous attackers are clogging the email inboxes of Jewish leaders around the country, warning, without much evidence, that Dean would somehow be bad for Israel. This worry was absurd, because Dean is in fact an unabashed supporter of Israel. His campaign co-chair was former Aipac President Stephen Grossman, and Dean said his own views on the Middle East more closely reflected those of Aipac than the more moderate Americans for Peace Now. Moreover, Dean's wife is Jewish, and his children were raised Jewish as well. Dean wasn't questioning U.S. support for Israel. He had merely suggested that to bring the sides together, Washington should act as an honest broker. This is not a radical idea, but key groups in the lobby do not welcome the idea of even-handedness when it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Dean's failure to win the Democratic nomination has many causes, of course, but the incident underscored the potential cost of being anything less than ardently pro-Israel during a presidential campaign. Keeping the administration in line. Key organizations in the lobby also directly target the administration in power. The principal mission of the Conference of Presidents is to pressure the White House when it acts in ways that the conference opposes, as it did when Gerald Ford threatened to reassess U.S. support for Israel, when George H.W. Bush briefly withheld loan guarantees in 1992, or as discussed in Chapter 7, when George W. Bush called for the creation of a Palestinian state in the immediate aftermath of September 11. But there is an even more obvious way to shape an administration's policy. The lobby's goals are served when individuals who share its perspective occupy important positions in the executive branch. In a notorious incident in 1992, for example, New York businessman Chaim Katz, calling as a potential donor to pro-Israel candidates, secretly taped a phone call with Aipac President David Steiner. In addition to describing how Aipac had helped direct campaign contributions to friendly politicians, Steiner told Katz that he had met personally to cut a deal with Secretary of State James Baker for $3 billion in foreign aid to Israel, plus $1 billion in other goodies that people don't even know about. More to the point, he told Katz that we have a dozen people in Clinton's campaign in the headquarters, and they're all going to get big jobs. Steiner was forced to resign after Katz went public, and he later said his statements to Katz were not true, but there is little reason to doubt the thrust of his remarks. After all, wouldn't any powerful interest group want individuals who shared its views to get key appointments in each administration? In fact, plenty of other lobbies have done exactly that. Former Secretary of the Interior Gail Norton and Deputy Secretary J. Stephen Griles both worked as lobbyists for oil or mining industries prior to their appointments in the Bush administration, for example, and Daniel A. Troy was a lawyer who frequently represented tobacco and pharmaceutical companies before being appointed chief counsel to the Food and Drug Administration in 2001. The Israel lobby is no different. As we have noted, the Clinton administration's Middle East policy was heavily shaped by officials with close ties to Israel or to prominent pro-Israel organizations. The two most notable individuals in this regard were Martin Indyk, the former deputy director of research at Aipac and co-founder of the pro-Israel Washington Institute for Near East Policy, who served on Clinton's National Security Council as ambassador to Israel 1995 to 97, 2000 to 2001, and as Assistant Secretary of State 1997 to 2000, and Dennis Ross, who served as Clinton's special envoy to the Middle East and joined YNEP after leaving government in 2001. They were among President Clinton's closest advisors at the Camp David summit in July 2000. Although both Indyk and Ross supported the Oslo peace process and favored the creation of a Palestinian state, which led hardliners to denounce them unfairly for betraying Israel, they did so only within the limits of what would be acceptable to Israeli leaders. As discussed in Chapter 1, the American delegation at Camp David took most of its cues from Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, coordinated negotiating positions with Israel in advance, and did not offer its own independent proposals for settling the conflict. Even the Clinton parameters, presented in December 2000, were less an independent American proposal than Clinton's summary of where the negotiations stood and his assessment of the bargaining space within which a solution might be found. Palestinian negotiators complained that the Israelis would sometimes present them with a specific proposal, and then later the Americans would offer the same idea, only the Americans would label it a bridging proposal. As another member of the U.S. team later admitted, Israeli proposals were often presented to the Palestinians as U.S. concepts, not Israeli ones, a subterfuge that fooled no one and reinforced Palestinian suspicions. Not surprisingly, Palestinian representatives protested that they were negotiating with two Israeli teams, one displaying an Israeli flag and one an American flag. The issue is not whether individuals like Indyk or Ross were dedicated public servants, acting in what they thought to be the best interest of the United States. They surely were. The issue, rather, is whether their well-known sympathies for Israel made it more difficult for the administration to operate effectively during the negotiations, and made it less inclined to bring U.S. leverage to bear on the Israeli government, thus reducing the chances of securing a peace deal. We believe that this situation hampered the entire Oslo process, including the abortive Camp David summit. The problem is even more pronounced in the Bush administration, whose ranks have included staunchly pro-Israel neoconservatives like Elliott Abrams, John Bolton, Douglas Feith, Aaron Friedberg, John Hanna, I. Lewis Libby, William Luty, Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, and David Wormser. As we shall see in Part 2, these officials consistently pushed for policies favored by Israel and backed by key organizations in the lobby. By the same token, groups in the lobby also try to make sure that people who are seen as critical of Israel do not get important foreign policy jobs. In 1987, former Aipac head Tom Dine told an interviewer that Aipac was helping vet presidential advisors, saying, "This is an actual example. One of the 1988 presidential candidates called us and said, 'I will be publicly declaring soon, and I am interested in hiring so-and-so for a top campaign position. Tell me what you think about him.' Dine said his answer was thumbs up in that case, but others are less fortunate. Jimmy Carter wanted to make George Ball his first Secretary of State, but he knew that Ball was perceived as critical of Israel and that the lobby would oppose the appointment. Similarly, Richard Marius, a Harvard lecturer hired in 1995 as Vice President Al Gore's chief speechwriter, has said that he was fired before he began work after New Republic publisher Martin Peretz, who was Gore's undergraduate tutor and a close confidant, falsely claimed that Marius was an anti-Semite, based on a book review Marius had published in Harvard Magazine in 1992. A few years later, in 2001, when Bruce Riedel left his position handling Middle East issues on the National Security Council, the New Republic reported that the Pentagon had held up the appointment of Riedel's designated successor, Middle East expert Alina Romanowski, whom Pentagon officials suspect of being insufficiently supportive of the Jewish state. The person appointed instead was Elliott Abrams, who had previously pleaded guilty to withholding information from Congress during the Iran-Contra affair. Abrams is hardly objective about Israel, having previously written in a 1997 book that there can be no doubt that Jews, faithful to the covenant between God and Abraham, are to stand apart from the nation in which they live. It is the very nature of being Jewish to be apart, except in Israel, from the rest of the population. This is a remarkable comment coming from an individual who holds a critically important position on Middle East policy in the U.S. government. For the government of Israel, wrote Nathan Gutman in Haaretz, his appointment was a gift from heaven. Conclusion. Like other foreign policy interest groups, the Israel lobby seeks to influence the U.S. government through a variety of different channels. It is in a better position to do so than most other groups, which is one reason its efforts are so effective. But its efforts are not limited to building influence inside the Beltway. The lobby also strives to shape public discourse about Israel and the Middle East, so that the American public generally supports a pro-Israel orientation, and does not question the merits of unconditional U.S. backing. This second strategy is the subject of the next chapter. Chapter 6: Dominating Public Discourse. One of the lobby's central concerns is to ensure that public discourse about Israel echoes the strategic and moral rationales dissected in Chapters 2 and 3. Its various elements do this by constantly reaffirming Israel's strategic value, by repeating one-sided accounts about Israel and its founding, and by defending Israel's actions in policy debates. The goal is to convince the public that America's and Israel's interests and values are one and the same. At the same time, groups in the lobby try to marginalize anyone who criticizes Israeli policy or challenges the special relationship, and try to prevent that person's views from getting a fair hearing in the public arena. To do this, the lobby sometimes employs heavy-handed tactics to silence critics, accusing them of being anti-Israel or anti-Semitic. Channeling public discourse in a pro-Israel direction is critically important, because an open and candid discussion of Israeli policy in the occupied territories, Israeli history, and the lobby's role in shaping America's Middle East policy might easily lead more Americans to question existing policy toward Israel and to call for a relationship with Israel that more effectively served the U.S. national interest. Accordingly, key elements in the lobby strive to influence discourse about Israel in the media, think tanks, and academia, because these institutions are critical to shaping popular opinion. They promote efforts to portray Israel in a positive light, and they go to considerable lengths to marginalize anyone who questions Israel's past or present conduct, or seeks to cast doubt on the merits of unconditional U.S. backing. Pro-Israel forces are well aware that dominating discussions about the Jewish state is essential to their agenda. These efforts do not always succeed, of course, but are still remarkably effective. The media is the message. A key part of preserving positive public attitudes toward Israel is to ensure that the mainstream media's coverage of Israel and the Middle East consistently favors Israel and does not call U.S. support into question in any way. While serious criticism of Israel occasionally reaches a large audience across the United States, the American media's coverage of Israel tends to be strongly biased in Israel's favor, especially when compared with news coverage in other democracies. This claim might sound to some like the old anti-Semitic accusation that Jews control the media. It is anything but. There is no question that some Jewish Americans, such as Martin Peretz and Mortimer Zuckerman, use their positions in the media to advance their views on Israel and the Middle East. This behavior is legitimate and unsurprising, as all elites tend to use their privileged positions to advance their various interests. More to the point, however, there are certainly owners, publishers, editors, columnists, and reporters in the mainstream media who have no special feelings for Israel and would feel comfortable criticizing its policies as well as the United States-Israel relationship. There are surely even influential individuals who may be strongly pro-Israel, but would nevertheless welcome a more open discourse about that country. It is therefore wrong and objectionable to argue that Jews or pro-Israel forces control the media and what they say about Israel. In fact, the reason that the lobby works so hard to monitor and influence what the mainstream media says about Israel is precisely that the lobby does not control them. If the media were left to their own devices, they would not serve up as consistent a diet of pro-Israel coverage and commentary. Instead, there would be a more open and lively discussion about the Jewish state and U.S. policy toward it, as there is in virtually every other democracy in the world. Indeed, that debate is especially lively in Israel itself, the one state where Jews clearly do control the media. The lobby's perspective on Israel is widely reflected in the mainstream media, in part because a substantial number of American commentators who write about Israel are themselves pro-Israel. In a 1976 comparison of domestic interest groups and U.S. Middle East policy, Robert H. Trice found that one of the most serious political handicaps of pro-Arab groups during the 1966 to 1974 period was their inability to gain support from any of the best-known and nationally syndicated columnists. Trice also found that pro-Israel groups could count on media support not only from national columnists, but also from the editors of some of the country's most widely read newspapers. Pro-Israel groups were more active shaping media coverage than pro-Arab groups were. In 1970, for example, the Conference of Presidents distributed press kits, complete with photos and feature stories, to more than 1,700 newspapers and to major wire services. In Trice's words, at virtually every level of media organization, from local communities, syndicated columnists, and major national papers, to the international news services that supply the country with information, pro-Israel groups were more successful than pro-Arab groups at getting their side of the story transmitted to both the articulate and mass publics. Matters have not changed much since then. The debate among Middle East pundits, wrote media critic Eric Alterman in 2002, is dominated by people who cannot imagine criticizing Israel. He listed 56 columnists and commentators who can be counted upon to support Israel reflexively and without qualification. Conversely, Alterman identified only 5 pundits who consistently criticize Israeli behavior or endorse pro-Arab positions. Although some readers subsequently challenged Alterman's coding of a handful of cases, and a few of those he listed are now deceased, the disparity remains overwhelming, and the challenges did not undermine his core claim. Consider the columnists who have covered the Middle East for the New York Times and the Washington Post in recent years. William Safire and the late A.M. Rosenthal were passionate defenders of Israel, and in Safire's case, especially favorable toward Ariel Sharon. Today, David Brooks consistently defends Israel's position. Thomas Friedman is more moderate. He has been critical of some of Israel's policies, and occasionally the lobby itself, but he almost never takes the Palestinian side or advocates that the United States distance itself from Israel. Nicholas Kristof is frequently critical of various aspects of American foreign policy and wrote one controversial column in March 2007 decrying the lack of serious public discussion of U.S. relations with Israel. But the Middle East is not a frequent theme in his commentary, and he certainly did not take a pro-Palestinian position. Maureen Dowd has been sharply critical of pro-Israel neoconservatives, but like Kristof, she rarely writes about the Jewish state or U.S. policy toward it. No one in the Times stable of regular columnists is a consistent defender of the Palestinians, or even as even-handed as former columnist Anthony Lewis, who retired in 2001. As for the Washington Post, it has had several columnists in recent years who consistently supported Israel: Jim Hoagland, Robert Kagan, Charles Krauthammer, and George Will. It used to feature 2 others, the late Michael Kelly and William Crystal, who runs the Weekly Standard and has a column in Time. Not only were these individuals staunchly pro-Israel, they tended to favor the ideas and policies of the hawkish Likud party rather than Israeli moderates. Richard Cohen also writes about the Middle East for the Post, but he has the same profile as the Times' Friedman, attached to Israel but willing to offer qualified and intelligent criticism. Neither of these papers, which are arguably the two most influential daily newspapers in the United States, employs any full-time commentator who consistently favors the Arab or Palestinian side. In recent years, the only prominent columnist who has frequently criticized Israel was Robert Novak, whose column is syndicated by the Chicago Sun-Times and regularly appears in the Post. Still, Novak is hardly a champion of the Palestinian cause. The fact is that the other side has no equivalent of Sapphire and Krauthammer, or even Friedman and Cohen, at either the Times or the Post, or any other major American newspaper, for that matter. The Los Angeles Times, for example, regularly publishes 3 opinion columnists who are staunch defenders of Israel: Max Boot, Jonathan Chait, and Jonah Goldberg. It employs no columnist who is critical of Israel, much less anyone who routinely defends the Palestinians against the Israelis. Although these papers occasionally publish guest op-eds that challenge Israeli policy, the balance of opinion clearly favors Israel. There is no American commentator comparable to a Robert Fisk or a Patrick Seal, who are often sharply critical of Israel and who publish regularly in British newspapers, and no one remotely like Israeli commentators Amira Haas, Akiva Eldar, Gideon Levy, and Bradley Burston, all of whom are openly critical of particular policies that their country pursues. The point here is not that these individuals are always right and pro-Israel commentators are wrong. The point is that voices like theirs are almost entirely absent from major American newspapers. Not surprisingly, this pro-Israel bias is also reflected in newspaper editorials. Robert Bartley, the late editor of the Wall Street Journal, once remarked, "Shamir, Sharon, Bibi, whatever those guys want is pretty much fine by me." The Journal, along with other prominent newspapers like the Chicago Sun-Times, the New York Sun, and the Washington Times, regularly run editorials that read as if they were written by the Israeli Prime Minister's press office. To its credit, the New York Times editorials sometimes criticize Israeli policies, and in recent years the criticism has occasionally been strongly worded. The Times recognizes that the Palestinians have legitimate grievances and a right to have their own state. Still, its treatment of the two sides over the years has not been even-handed. In his memoirs, former Times executive editor Max Frankel recounted the impact his own pro-Israel attitudes had on his editorial choices. "I was much more deeply devoted to Israel than I dared to assert. Fortified by my knowledge of Israel and my friendships there, I myself wrote most of our Middle East commentaries. As more Arab than Jewish readers recognized, I wrote them from a pro-Israel perspective." Magazines like Commentary, The New Republic, and The Weekly Standard also zealously defend Israel at every turn. Indeed, Commentary's former editor Norman Podhoretz once told a gathering of journalists in Jerusalem that the role of Jews who write in both the Jewish and general press is to defend Israel and not join in the attacks on Israel. Martin Peretz, the longtime editor of The New Republic, once proclaimed, "I am in love with the state of Israel," and admitted that there's a sort of party line on Israel at his journal. The media's reporting of news events involving Israel is less slanted than their editorial commentary, in part because most reporters strive to be objective, but also because it is difficult to cover events in the occupied territories or in southern Lebanon without acknowledging Israel's actual behavior. But still, to discourage unfavorable reporting on Israel, groups in the lobby organize letter-writing campaigns, demonstrations, and boycotts against news outlets whose content they consider anti-Israel. As The Forward reported in April 2002, rooting out perceived anti-Israel bias in the media has become for many American Jews the most direct and emotional outlet for connecting with the conflict 6,000 miles away. One CNN executive has said that he sometimes gets 6,000 email messages in a single day complaining that a story is anti-Israel, and papers such as the Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, the Miami Herald, the New York Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the Washington Post have faced consumer boycotts over their Middle East reporting. One correspondent told journalist Michael Massing that newspapers were afraid of Aipac and other pro-Israel groups, saying that the pressure from these groups is relentless. Editors would just as soon not touch them. As the former spokesman for the Israeli consulate in New York, Menachem Shalev, once put it, "Of course, a lot of self-censorship goes on. Journalists, editors, and politicians are going to think twice about criticizing Israel if they know they are going to get thousands of angry calls in a matter of hours. The Jewish lobby is good at orchestrating pressure."